If a poll were taken among Chicago gangsters of the 1970s on who is the most dangerous man on the street, many would vote for Harry Aleman. A Chicago mob enforcer with the nickname Hook, Harry was a lean and unthreatening man in appearance, but his credibility in criminal circles was extremely high, so much that his name became the weapon of choice for racketeers. In 1978, 2 Chicago loan sharks were sent to prison for extorting $6,500 from a tavern owner. They promised that if the man didn't pay them back, Harry Aleman himself would come for his soul, but as the investigation showed, it was a pure bluff. Harry Aleman was a kind of tax inspector for the mafia, collecting tribute from bookies and street crooks. If someone did not want to play by his rules, Aleman used force, but those who resisted over time became less and less. The underworld quickly learned that going up against this guy meant death. And if you're interested in learning more about exactly how he earned such a reputation, then meet Harry Aleman on the other side of the law. His story began in the Taylor Street neighborhood of Chicago. Harry Aleman was born on January 19, 1939, becoming the first son of Louis and Mary Virginia Aleman. His mother was Italian and his father was from the Mexican state of Durango. It's believed that Louis Aleman had some kind of authority in the criminal world and may have suffered from drug addiction. Harry had major problems with his father, as Louis was characterized by a strict temper and did not hesitate to put his hand on family members. According to Aleman's memories, his father beat him every day over the smallest trifles. When his mother tried to stop him, she was hit herself. From the age of 11, Harry had a break from this mayhem when Louis went to jail on robbery charges. Then the beating continued until Harry moved out of his parents' house. The family lived in an apartment that belonged to the Aleman's maternal grandmother. There were numerous uncles, aunts, and cousins in the neighborhood. Aleman's family was often faced with a lack of money, but this was not an obstacle to their eldest son's education. Aleman graduated from high school in 1955, where he excelled as a soccer player, a member of the physics club, and a boxer. It was in high school that he earned the nickname Hook for his crowning side hook. Aleman then enrolled at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts and earned a degree in commercial painting in 1958. After graduation, he worked for a while selling racetrack itineraries and market items before plunging into the world of crime. He was brought there by future Chicago mob boss Joseph Ferriola, who became Aleman's uncle by marrying his mother's sister. As Ferriola rose in the mafia hierarchy, Aleman followed. Harry joined the so-called Taylor Street crew, which included 4 other mobsters in addition to him and Joe Ferriola. According to Aleman, Joe instructed the team members to consolidate their position in Chicago at the level that the mafia had during Al Capone's reign. Along with his uncle, Aleman began reorganizing sports betting operations and collecting tributes from independent bookmakers. As additional income, he and his associates began committing burglaries. Aleman received his first conviction in 1962. He, his brother Freddie, and 2 buddies were hanging out at a bar on North State Street when they pushed a woman through a storefront window for some reason. In the same bar was a policeman's son, Howard Pearson, who forced the rambunctious group out onto the street. While the police arrived to sort things out, Aleman attacked Pearson and broke his jaw, earning him 2 years probation. He also faced other charges in the 60s for which he managed to avoid arrest. His crimes included malicious mischief, illegal gambling, possession of burglary tools, assault, armed robbery, and kidnapping. But there was another side to this dangerous gangster. Like his Italian relatives, Harry Aleman held family in high regard. From the recollections of his adopted daughter Frankie, a very different portrait of Harry Aleman can be painted. In 1964, Aleman married Ruth Felper Mustari, a widow with 4 children. Due to some accident at a young age, Aleman was unable to have kids of his own and compensated by caring for Ruth's children. He made time for each child, taking the family on camping trips, to amusement parks, and on picnics. Being an artist by training, he also made sure to instill a love of art in the family. In Aleman's own words, he cared for his stepchildren as if they were his own. But how did this touching image fit with Aleman's work on the street? Did Ruth know about her husband's secret? Most likely, yes. Did the children know? Certainly Aleman did everything he could to keep them from knowing. According to Frankie's memory, he had a regular schedule that did not arouse suspicion. Aleman left home before 6 in the morning and arrived before the children returned from school and extracurricular activities. Evenings were most often devoted to his wife and kids. True, there were a few oddities that it was customary for the family not to ask about. For example, if Aleman was home, he was the only one who could open the door at a sudden knock. One day, as the family was preparing for Sunday dinner, there was a loud knock on the door. A man of imposing size stood on the threshold. The stranger told Aleman that the children had jumped on his pickup truck and scratched it up. Frankie recalled that her father took her by the elbow and told her that after dinner, they would wash the guy's truck and wax it, thus solving any problems. Everyone sat down at the table, and then the knocking came again. But this time it sounded different, as if something sharp had been stuck into the door. The stranger started calling out to Harry again and sounded somewhat indignant. Keeping his composure, Harry turned to his wife and said, "Honey, don't worry about a thing. I'll be back in a minute." He returned a few moments later wearing a t-shirt splattered with blood. When asked by his wife, Harry replied that everything was fine and everyone went back to dinner. What had just happened was quickly forgotten. Frankie also told her reporters about another strange incident. One evening, as she was about to leave the house, the doorbell rang. Frankie heard her father open the door and said sharply, "I told you not to come to my house." The intruder tried to explain something to him, but her father wasn't going to listen. He simply hit him several times and threw him out the door. Noticing his adopted daughter had witnessed his cruelty, Harry told her that the guy was crazy and dangerous, so he had to be kicked out. Frankie just accepted it. On September 27, 1972, an event occurred that shattered Aleman's typical life: the murder of a union member named William Logan. The initial version by the prosecutors was that Aleman killed Logan because he wouldn't let his team steal trucks, but further investigation showed that in this case, a personal motive played the main role. The fact is that Logan was the husband of Aleman's cousin, and the couple was going through a difficult divorce. Unable to agree on the custody of their only son, Aleman's cousin and her husband argued a lot, and sometimes it turned into physical fights. Aleman, who valued family above all else, could not forgive Logan for beating his cousin. So, at 11 p.m. on September 27th, Aleman and his associate drove up to William Logan's house. Over the previous month, they had been able to gather enough information about the identity and schedule of their would-be victim. William Logan was 37 years old and had grown up in Chicago, in the neighborhood known as Little Italy. After divorcing his wife, he settled in a house on West Walton Street with his sisters and nephews. Logan worked part-time as a cab driver and was just about to pick up his shift that evening. As Billy headed to his car, Aleman rolled down his window and fired 3 shots, 2 from a shotgun and 1 from a .45 caliber automatic pistol. Aleman and his accomplice then drove away before police arrived on the scene. The forensic evidence collected was insufficient to identify a perpetrator. The murder was committed very cleanly. However, there was one witness, a young man named Bobby Lowe, who was walking his dog that evening. He did not immediately tell the police about anything, listening to his father, who advised him to keep his mouth shut. But Lowe's conscience spoke louder, and a couple months later, he gave a statement. After looking at pictures of the suspects, he chose Aleman's photo. Then, after learning about who Harry Aleman was, Lowe's wife and parents corally begged him to refuse to cooperate with the persecutor, but he decided to follow through. His family was under guard 24 hours a day. Lowe had to leave his job and apartment, and his marriage to his wife fell in danger of collapsing. Harry Aleman was indicted in the fall of 1976. Prosecutors gained the cooperation of the guy who gave Aleman a ride on the day of Logan's murder. Thus, there were already 2 witnesses against him. But Harry had ties to the mafia, an organization with ties to politicians. One of the mob allies found a lawyer, Robert Cooley, and asked him to take over Aleman's case and bring in a judge who could be bribed. Cooley immediately thought of his buddy Frank Wilson, whom no one would suspect. Wilson was offered $10,000 and accepted, raising the amount slightly to compensate for the risk. The trial took place in May 1977. Ruth provided her husband with an alibi, saying that Aleman was with her on the golf course 3 blocks from their home on the evening of the murder. 3 people corroborated her words. Aleman himself could not contain a smirk while in the courtroom. He knew the case had already been decided in his favor. Judge Wilson allowed Aleman's lawyer to discredit both witnesses during cross-examination, pressing the questionable reputation of Aleman's former associate and the fact that Lowe's words were at odds with the police reports. When Wilson announced that Harry Aleman had been found not guilty, not only were prosecutors shocked, but also the public and the media. One of the most feared men on the streets of Chicago remained free. By this time, the list of murders he was believed to have been involved in was staggering. In October 1971, one Sam Casario was beaten with clubs and shot by 2 masked men. In December 1973, Richard Kane, who was an assistant to crime boss Sam Giancana, was shot and killed in a Chicago diner, again by 2 masked men. In April 1974, counterfeiter William Simon was found in the backseat of his car with his limbs bound and a bullet wound to the head. In September of that year, Robert Harder, a thief-turned-informant, was shot in the face and died in a field near the village of Dwight, Illinois. In 1975, Christopher Carty, a former police officer who gave high-interest loans to gamblers, was shot 8 times in the back and once in the face. In May 1976, 2 masked men shot and killed ex-convict James Irwin. And the following June, a robber named Joseph Frank Teo was found dead in the back of his car. And those aren't even all the crimes that have been linked to Aleman. Having won in court, Harry returned to his work and family life, but he did not have long to enjoy his freedom. As early as 1978, Aleman was arrested under RICO charges for organizing home invasions for the purpose of robbery. The court sentenced him to 30 years in prison, and Aleman spent the next 11 years in various correctional facilities. During this time, the gangster managed to take up several educational courses and even painting. Then, in April 1989, Aleman was granted parole. He returned home to his wife, kids, and recently born grandson. However, the FBI had no intentions of overlooking a man with such authority in the crime world, and Aleman started to be watched. All of this led to his 1991 conviction for extorting money from bookies, and he was sentenced again to 12 years behind bars. Aleman had expected to be released in 2003, but in 1993 he was refiled for Logan's murder. Basically, under the concept of double jeopardy, Aleman could not be retired for a case in which he was acquitted, but prosecutors managed to get around that rule. That's because some information about Aleman's judge and defense attorney had surfaced since the first trial. Back in the late 80s, investigators launched a large-scale operation aimed at uncovering corrupt ties with the mafia and members of the judiciary. Fearing prosecution for his actions during the Logan trial, Frank Wilson, who was the judge that acquitted Aleman in 1977 and was now retired, shot himself in an Arizona nursing home in February 1990. 3 years later, Aleman's former attorney, Robert Cooley, fleeing punishment, agreed to be an informant and shed light on the 1977 trial. In 1997, 20 years after his acquittal, Harry Aleman was retired for the murder of William Logan. This was the first time in U.S. history that a criminal was re-indicted for a crime in which he had previously been acquitted. The fact is that the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit ruled that the original trial was a sham because its outcome had been decided in advance by a bribe. According to this new ruling, the retrial did not violate the law in this case. On October 1, 1997, Aleman was sentenced to a term of 1 to 300 years in prison. Little is known about what happened to Harry Aleman from 1997 until his death, but on May 15, 2010, Aleman died of lung cancer at Hill Correctional Center in Galesburg, Illinois. Shortly before his passing, Frankie paid him one last visit, and they had an earnest conversation. Aleman worried about how his reputation affected Frankie and her family, and his stepdaughter reassured him. At one point, Frankie pulled together and asked her stepdad a direct question. Did he really kill William Logan? A slowly dying Aleman said no. Quote, "I've done a lot of bad things in my life, but that was not my fault. Given all the information we have, we can assume this was a lie told for the greater good." It seems the dangerous gangster only wanted to remain a good father in his children's eyes.